The dusty livestock auction yard in Millbrook Falls buzzed with cruel laughter as Thomas Hartwell raised his paddle for the final time. The grey donkey stood trembling in the corner, ribs showing through matted fur, one leg slightly crooked from an old injury. $500 for that broken-down mule? The auctioneer chuckled. You sure about this, old-timer? What the crowd didn't know was that Thomas had once been the greatest animal trainer in Europe, headlining circuses from Paris to Prague before a tragic accident destroyed everything he loved. He'd spent 15 years in this forgotten town, hiding from his past, working as a handyman. But something about this donkey's eyes, intelligent, defiant, familiar, called to him. As Thomas led his purchase away amid jeers and whispers, the donkey turned and looked directly at him. For just a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw a flash of gold in those dark eyes, like ancient magic awakening. The townspeople thought they'd witnessed a fool's bargain. They had no idea they'd just seen the beginning of a miracle that would change everything. But what was the connection between this mysterious donkey and Thomas's tragic past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas felt the weight of every stare as he walked through the parking lot, the donkey's hooves clicking unevenly on the asphalt. His weathered hands gripped the lead rope tighter than necessary, muscle memory from decades of working with animals still intact despite the years of forced retirement. The whispers followed them like shadows. Poor old Thomas has finally lost it completely. $500 for that pathetic creature. Should have put it out of its misery instead. He'd heard worse, much worse. In Prague, when the tent collapsed and the screaming started, when the newspapers painted him as a monster, when everything he'd built crumbled in a single terrible night. These small-town gossips were nothing compared to that inferno of judgment. The donkey stumbled slightly, favoring its injured leg, and Thomas instinctively slowed his pace. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice rusty from disuse, but carrying an undertone that seemed to settle the animal's nerves. It was a voice that had once commanded lions to sit, elephants to dance, and horses to perform feats that defied gravity. As they reached his battered pickup truck, Thomas studied his purchase more carefully. Beneath the neglect and malnourishment, there was something else. The bone structure was refined, almost aristocratic. The ears, though drooping with exhaustion, were perfectly shaped. And those eyes, they held depths that seemed impossible for any ordinary beast. "What's your story?" Thomas whispered, running his hand along the donkey's neck. The animal's skin twitched at the contact, but it didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned slightly into his touch, as if recognizing something familiar in his gentle handling. Loading the donkey into his trailer took patience. Each movement seemed to pain the creature, but there was no aggression, no fear-based resistance, just a weary resignation that Thomas recognized all too well. It was the same expression he'd seen in his own mirror for the past 15 years. The drive to his small farm on the outskirts of town was quiet, except for the rumble of the engine and the occasional shift of weight from the trailer behind him. Thomas found himself thinking about the moment their eyes had first met across the auction yard. The donkey had been scheduled for slaughter, a mercy killing, the previous owner had called it. Nobody expected anyone to bid, let alone pay real money for what everyone considered a lost cause. But Thomas had seen something else. A spark of intelligence, yes, but more than that. Recognition, as if the donkey knew him from somewhere, some other life, some other time. His farmhouse came into view as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It wasn't much. A small cottage, a barn that had seen better days, and 20 acres of pasture that he'd been maintaining more from habit than purpose. He'd bought the place with the last of his circus earnings, intending it as a temporary refuge. Temporary had stretched into a decade and a half. As he backed the trailer up to the barn, Thomas caught sight of something that made his breath catch. In the side mirror, for just an instant, the donkey's reflection seemed different, taller, more majestic, with a coat that gleamed silver-white instead of dull grey. He blinked, and the illusion was gone, leaving only the tired, broken animal he'd purchased. His hands shook slightly as he turned off the engine. In all his years working with exotic animals, he'd learned to trust his instincts about their hidden natures. Lions that seemed fierce but craved gentleness, elephants that appeared docile but harbored fierce intelligence. And once, long ago in a traveling menagerie outside Vienna, a white stallion whose eyes held the same impossible depth he'd just witnessed. That horse had changed his life, launching him to fame across Europe's greatest circus stages. That horse had also been present on the night everything went wrong. Thomas stepped out of the truck and walked slowly to the back of the trailer, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread he hadn't felt in years. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones as Marcus led the donkey through the narrow streets toward his lodgings on the outskirts of town. Behind them, the market square still buzzed with whispered conversations and pointing fingers. He could feel their stares burning into his back, but he'd grown accustomed to being the subject of gossip. Ever since his fall from grace 3 years ago, he'd become something of a local curiosity, the once mighty acrobat who now scraped together coins by mending harnesses and cleaning stables. The donkey moved with surprising grace, despite its obvious ailments. Its breathing was labored, yes, and its coat patchy, but there was something in the way it carried itself that spoke of hidden strength. Marcus had seen enough performers in his lifetime to recognize when someone was hiding their true capabilities behind a carefully constructed facade. "What's your story, old friend?" he murmured, running his weathered hand along the donkey's neck. The animal's ears twitched forward, and for a moment Marcus could have sworn he saw intelligence flash in those dark eyes. Not the simple awareness of a farm animal, but something deeper, more knowing. They reached the ramshackle cottage Marcus called home, a structure that had seen better decades. The roof leaked in 2 places, the windows were cracked, and the wooden fence surrounding the small yard leaned at precarious angles. But it was private, tucked away behind a grove of ancient oak trees, and the previous tenant had left behind a serviceable stable. As Marcus unlatched the gate, the donkey stopped abruptly. Its nostrils flared, and it turned its head toward the forest beyond the cottage. The animal's entire demeanor changed, muscles tensing beneath its rough coat, ears swiveling like sentinels scanning for danger. "What is it?" Marcus followed the donkey's gaze but saw nothing except shadows dancing between the trees. Still, something made the hair on his arms stand on end. The forest had grown too quiet. Even the ever-present chirping of sparrows had ceased. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. The donkey shook its head and continued toward the stable as if nothing had happened. Marcus frowned, but attributed the strange behavior to the stress of being in an unfamiliar place. Inside the stable, he prepared a stall with fresh hay and filled a water trough from the well. The donkey drank deeply, and Marcus noticed that with each passing hour, its breathing seemed to grow easier. Perhaps all the animal needed was proper care and attention. "I suppose you'll need a name," Marcus said, settling onto a wooden crate to watch his new companion. "Can't keep calling you Donkey forever." As if responding to his words, the animal lifted its head from the water trough and fixed him with that unnervingly intelligent stare. In the dim light of the stable, Marcus noticed something he'd missed at the auction, a peculiar marking on the donkey's forehead, barely visible beneath its shaggy forelock. It looked almost like a symbol, geometric and precise, as if it had been deliberately placed there. Marcus leaned forward for a better look, but the donkey turned away, suddenly shy. "Easy there," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the stable windows when Marcus heard voices approaching from the direction of town. He recognized the booming laugh of Willem the blacksmith and the higher pitch of Martha the baker. They were probably coming to get a closer look at his foolish purchase. "Marcus," Willem's voice carried across the yard, "thought we'd come see how you're settling in with your new prize." Marcus stepped out of the stable to find not just Willem and Martha, but half a dozen other townspeople clustered near his gate. Their expressions ranged from amused to genuinely concerned. "That poor creature," Martha clucked, craning her neck to peer around him. "It's probably suffering. The merciful thing would be to put it out of its misery." "Nonsense," countered old Henrik, who ran the grain mill. "Marcus has a way with animals. Remember how he gentled that wild stallion that came through town last summer?" The mention of his past skills with animals brought a familiar pang to Marcus's chest. Before his circus days, before the bright lights and cheering crowds, he'd been known throughout his village for his ability to communicate with horses, dogs, even wild birds. It was a gift that had made him valuable to the circus masters, though they'd been more interested in teaching him to fly through the air than to listen to what the animals were telling him. "Where is the beast, anyway?" Willem asked, pushing past Marcus toward the stable. Before Marcus could protest, the blacksmith had reached the stable door. What happened next would be talked about in the taverns for months to come. As Willem's shadow fell across the threshold, the donkey let out a sound unlike anything any of them had heard before. Not a bray, but something that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fairgrounds as Marcus led Ember away from the auction tent. Behind them, laughter erupted like scattered fireworks, each burst of mockery driving deeper into his already wounded pride. The donkey stumbled beside him, her breathing labored, ribs visible beneath her matted coat. 23 silver pieces," someone called out, "for that bag of bones. Marcus has finally lost what little sense he had left." Marcus kept walking, his weathered hands steady on the rope. He'd heard worse in the months since the accident, since the town had stripped him of his position as master of the Grand Celestial Circus. The fall that shattered his left leg had also shattered his reputation, leaving him with a twisted gait and empty pockets. Ember wheezed beside him, her steps uneven. Every few yards, she'd stop completely, forcing Marcus to pause and wait. The crowd's jeers followed them like persistent flies. "She won't last the week," predicted old Henrik, the blacksmith. "That animal's got one hoof in the grave." Marcus finally turned, his grey eyes flashing with the fire that had once commanded audiences of thousands. "A week's all some of us need to prove ourselves." The crowd fell silent, remembering perhaps the man who had once walked tightropes 50 feet above their heads, who had trained lions and commanded eagles. Henrik shifted uncomfortably and found somewhere else to look. They made their way slowly through the town's narrow streets. Ember's condition was worse than Marcus had initially thought. Her left rear leg bore an old injury that had healed poorly, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Dark patches around her eyes spoke of recent illness, and her spirit seemed as broken as her body. At the edge of town, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt paths, Marcus stopped at a small cottage that had seen better days. The roof sagged in places, and wild vines had claimed much of the outer walls. It wasn't much, but it was his, the only thing left from his former life that the creditors couldn't touch. In the back garden, he'd built a small stable from salvaged wood. Nothing like the grand facilities he'd once overseen, but it would shelter one sick donkey. He led Ember inside, noting how she trembled despite the day's warmth. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running his hands along her neck. She flinched at first, then gradually relaxed under his touch. Years of working with frightened animals had taught him patience. He fetched water from the well and was surprised when Ember drank deeply. Her appetite for the hay he offered was less encouraging. She nibbled listlessly, more from politeness than hunger. Marcus frowned, recognizing the signs. He'd seen it in circus animals before, that particular kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical ailment. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself simply sitting with the donkey, watching her labored breathing. Something about her struck him as familiar, though he couldn't place what. Her eyes, perhaps. They held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and a sadness that mirrored his own. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he said softly. Broken down and cast aside, Ember's ears twitched at his voice. For a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus felt an odd sensation, like recognition passing between them. He shook his head, dismissing the notion as foolishness. By evening, Ember's condition had worsened. Her breathing became more erratic, and she lay down heavily in the straw. Marcus brought blankets from the house, wrapping them around her shivering form. He considered calling for the town's animal healer, then remembered his nearly empty purse. Instead, he sat beside her through the night, one hand resting on her neck, feeling each labored breath. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the stable's small window. In that ethereal glow, something extraordinary happened. Ember's breathing began to steady, and a subtle warmth spread from where Marcus's hand touched her. The sensation was familiar yet impossible. He'd felt it before, years ago, when working with his most extraordinary circus animals. It was the feeling of magic awakening, of dormant power stirring to life. The donkey's eyes opened, fixing on his with startling clarity. For just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw something more than animal intelligence looking back at him, something ancient and knowing, and deeply sad. Then the moment passed. Ember closed her eyes and drifted into what appeared to be peaceful sleep. But the warmth lingered under Marcus's palm, and he noticed that her breathing had grown stronger, more regular. He settled back against the stable wall, unwilling to break the contact. Whatever had just happened, it felt significant, like the first note of a song he'd forgotten he knew how to play. Outside, the town slept on, unaware that in a tumble-down stable at its edge, two broken souls had found something neither had dared hope for, the possibility of redemption. The morning brought with it a peculiar silence that settled over Gideon's modest cottage like a held breath. He woke to find Ember standing in the exact center of the small paddock, motionless as a statue carved from shadow. The donkey's ears weren't twitching at flies, his tail wasn't swishing, and even his breathing seemed deliberately measured. Most unsettling of all were his eyes, fixed directly on Gideon through the kitchen window with an intensity that made the former performer's coffee cup rattle against the saucer. "Well then," Gideon muttered, pulling on his weathered boots, "I suppose we're having a staring contest this morning." But when he stepped outside, Ember's demeanor shifted instantly. The donkey began pacing the fence line with deliberate steps, pausing at the gate to fix Gideon with that same penetrating stare before resuming his circuit. It was behavior Gideon recognized from his circus days, the restless energy of a performer waiting for their cue. "You want to go somewhere, don't you?" The words left his mouth before he'd fully formed the thought. Ember stopped pacing immediately and approached the gate, pressing his muzzle against the latch with surprising gentleness. Against every grain of common sense he possessed, Gideon opened the gate. Ember stepped through with dignified purpose and began walking toward the forest path that wound behind the cottage. When Gideon hesitated, the donkey turned back and waited, as if to say, "Far you coming or not?" The path led deeper into the thornwood than Gideon had ventured in months. Ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches overhead, creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. Ember moved with sure-footed confidence, despite his supposed frailty, navigating fallen logs and rocky outcroppings without hesitation. Gideon found himself hurrying to keep pace, his performer's instincts telling him that, whatever was happening, he was meant to follow. They walked for what felt like hours before Ember finally stopped at a clearing Gideon had never seen before. In its center stood the remnants of what might once have been a magnificent tree. Now only a hollow trunk remained, its interior blackened as if by some great fire. The air here felt different, charged with an energy that made Gideon's skin prickle and his old acrobat muscles tense with anticipation. Ember approached the hollow trunk and touched his nose to its charred surface. The moment of contact sent a shiver through the clearing that Gideon felt in his bones. Then, impossibly, the donkey began to change. It started with his coat, the dull grey brightening to silver, then deepening to black so pure it seemed to absorb light. His frame filled out, the jutting ribs disappearing beneath sleek muscle. His mane, previously sparse and matted, grew thick and lustrous. But it was his eyes that truly transformed, from weary brown to brilliant amber, burning with an intelligence that was decidedly not equine. Gideon stumbled backward, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. What in God's name? The creature that had been Ember turned to face him, and when it spoke, its voice resonated, not from its throat, but from somewhere deeper, older. I am not what I appeared to be, Gideon Thorne, just as you are not what you appear to be. You can talk. It was perhaps the most inadequate response possible, but Gideon's circus-trained ability to adapt to the impossible had momentarily abandoned him. Among other things, the being's amber eyes held what might have been amusement. I am Ember, but I am also Shadowmere, guardian of the spaces between worlds. I have been waiting a very long time for someone who could see past appearances to truth. And what truth is that? Gideon's voice had found its steadiness again, along with the showman's courage that had once carried him across high wires without nets. That magic has not left this world. It has only been forgotten, hidden, dismissed as foolishness by those who have forgotten how to believe in wonder. Shadowmere stepped closer, his transformed presence somehow both comforting and overwhelming. You were a bridge walker once, Gideon. You danced between earth and sky, made the impossible seem effortless. That gift was never about physical skill alone. The words struck something deep in Gideon's chest, a resonance he hadn't felt since his fall from grace. The circus. That was just entertainment? Performance? No. Shadowmere's voice carried absolute certainty. It was magic in its purest form. You made people believe, if only for moments, that the laws they thought governed their world were merely suggestions. Gideon looked around the clearing, seeing it now with different eyes. The hollow tree wasn't just a dead trunk. It was a doorway. The strange energy in the air wasn't atmospheric pressure. It was possibility itself, waiting to be shaped. What are you asking of me? Nothing you haven't already chosen. Shadowmere moved to stand beside him, a presence both powerful and patient. You bought a broken donkey when wisdom said to walk away. You're here now when caution would have kept you home. You've already decided, Gideon. The question is whether you're ready to remember who you really are. The morning mist clung to the hillside like a forgotten dream as Marcus led Lazarus up the winding path toward the ancient oak that crowned the ridge. 3 days had passed since the auction, and already the donkey's ribs were less prominent, his coat showing the faintest hint of its former luster. But it wasn't the physical transformation that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way Lazarus moved, deliberate and knowing, as if he understood exactly where they were heading. You feel it too, don't you? Marcus murmured, his weathered hand resting on the donkey's neck. The animal's ears swiveled forward, alert and focused on something beyond the visible horizon. As they crested the hill, the valley spread below them like a parchment map marked with shadow and light. But Marcus's gaze was drawn to something else entirely, a shimmer in the air near the old oak's gnarled roots, like heat waves rising from summer stone, except the morning was cool and damp. Lazarus stopped without being asked, his dark eyes fixed on the same spot. The shimmer intensified, and for a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw shapes moving within it, figures both familiar and impossible, calling to him across a distance measured not in miles but in years of buried shame. "The threshold," he whispered, the words escaping before he realized he'd spoken them aloud. How could he know that name? Yet it felt as natural as breathing, as if the knowledge had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. The donkey stepped forward, and the shimmer responded, growing brighter. Marcus felt a pull in his chest, gentle but insistent, like a tide drawing him toward an inevitable shore. His fingers found the small leather pouch at his belt, a gift from his grandmother, carried through every performance, every triumph, every devastating fall. Inside, 3 smooth stones that had never seemed important until this moment hummed with warmth against his palm. "We're not ready," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Lazarus or to the presence he could feel watching from within the shimmer. "I don't even know what we're supposed to do." But Lazarus was already moving again, his hooves finding sure purchase on the uneven ground. The donkey's transformation was accelerating now, his back straightening, his steps gaining strength and purpose. This was no longer the broken animal Marcus had rescued from the auction block. This was something else entirely, something that had been waiting for the right companion to awaken its true nature. As they approached the oak, Marcus felt memories that weren't his own flooding through his mind. Ancient roads stretching across impossible landscapes, cities that gleamed like jewels in perpetual twilight, creatures of myth and wonder that had once walked freely between worlds before the paths were sealed, before the magic retreated into shadow and legend. The shimmer pulsed, and suddenly Marcus understood. This wasn't just a doorway, it was a wound, a place where the barriers between worlds had grown thin and fragile. Something on the other side was in terrible danger, and somehow, impossibly, a disgraced circus performer and a stubborn donkey were the key to healing what had been broken. The stories were true, he breathed, thinking of his grandmother's tales of heroes who rode humble mounts to impossible victories. Not knights on destined steeds, but ordinary souls who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Lazarus nickered softly, a sound that held notes of both sorrow and hope. The donkey's transformation was complete now. His coat gleamed silver-grey in the strange light, his eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering, and when he looked at Marcus, it was with the gaze of an equal, a partner in whatever lay ahead. Marcus pulled the 3 stones from his pouch. They pulsed within a light now, responding to the proximity of the threshold. 1 stone for the path behind, 1 for the path ahead, and 1 for the choice that connected them. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "True magic isn't about power, Marcus. It's about being willing to step forward when everything tells you to run." The townspeople below would wake to find them gone, would assume Marcus had finally given up and moved on to another village, another chance at redemption. They would never know that salvation sometimes came in the most unexpected forms, or that heroes were often forged from the very souls the world had deemed worthless. Lazarus stepped toward the shimmer, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of stage fright mixed with anticipation that had once preceded every performance. But this wasn't a show. This was the role he'd been preparing for his entire life without knowing it. "Well then," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Let's see what destiny looks like." Together, they stepped into the light. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like ghostly fingers as Marcus led Stellan through the narrow streets toward the town square. Word had spread faster than wildfire about the mysterious healing at the widow Hartwell's cottage, and curious faces peered from windows and doorways. Some crossed themselves when they saw the donkey pass, while others whispered behind cupped hands. Marcus had barely slept. The events of the previous day churned in his mind like a restless sea. He understood now that Stellan was no ordinary creature, but the extent of the donkey's abilities remained a mystery wrapped in silver starlight and ancient magic. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy on his shoulders, heavier than any circus apparatus he'd ever rigged. They paused at the fountain in the center of the square, where Marcus cupped water in his palms for Stellan to drink. The donkey's coat gleamed with renewed health, no longer the dull grey of sickness but a lustrous silver that seemed to shimmer in the early light. His eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom accumulated over centuries, though Marcus couldn't fathom how such a thing was possible. "You're gathering quite the audience," Marcus murmured, glancing around at the growing crowd. Merchants setting up their stalls moved slowly, stealing glances. Children pressed their faces against shop windows. Even Father Benedict emerged from the cathedral, his weathered face creased with concern and curiosity. A commotion near the baker's shop drew their attention. Mrs. Holbrook, the seamstress, was helping her son Timothy navigate through the crowd with his walking stick. The boy had been blind since birth, his world one of sounds and textures and the patient guidance of his mother's voice. But today, something was different. Timothy's head was raised, his sightless eyes turned directly toward Stellan with an expression of wonder. "Mother," he whispered, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "I can see light. There's light everywhere, but it's strongest. There." His thin finger pointed straight at the donkey. Mrs. Holbrook gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The crowd pressed closer, but Marcus felt Stellan tense beneath his touch. The donkey's ears flattened slightly, not in aggression, but in something like wariness, or perhaps sorrow. "Please," Marcus called out, raising his hand to halt the advancing townspeople. "Give us space. This isn't a spectacle." But his words fell on deaf ears. The baker, a rotund man named Cornelius, pushed to the front with his wife clinging to his arm. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing labored from the lung sickness that had plagued her for months. "If it's true what they say," Cornelius panted, "if your beast can heal, then help my Elena. Please, I'll give you anything, my shop, my savings, anything." More voices joined his plea. Old Henrik hobbled forward on his gnarled legs, arthritis having bent him nearly double. Young Sarah clutched her infant son, whose constant crying spoke of some internal pain the town physician couldn't identify. One by one, they came forward with their afflictions, their desperate hopes, their raw need. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being center stage, but this was different from his circus days. There were no bright lights and applause here, only suffering and the terrible weight of expectation. He looked down at Stellan, whose dark eyes met his, with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. "I don't know how this works," Marcus admitted quietly to the donkey. "I don't know what you are or what you can do, but they're hurting." Stellan stepped forward, his hooves clicking against the cobblestones with deliberate purpose. The crowd held its collective breath as he approached young Timothy first. The boy's mother started to pull him back, protective instinct overriding hope, but Timothy himself reached out with trembling fingers. When his small hand touched Stellan's muzzle, the square filled with the softest silver light, not harsh or blinding, but gentle as moonbeams on water. Timothy gasped, his eyes widening as pupils that had never known sight suddenly dilated and focused. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the boy could see his mother's face, could see the wonder and joy and disbelief written there. Then the light faded, and Timothy's eyes grew cloudy once more. But something had changed. Though his physical sight had returned to darkness, there was a brightness in his expression that hadn't been there before, a sense of peace, of having touched something divine. "I saw her," he whispered to his weeping mother. "I saw you, and you're beautiful." Stellan stepped back, swaying slightly. Marcus caught the donkey's neck, feeling the tremor of exhaustion that ran through the powerful frame. Whatever gift Stellan possessed came at a cost, one that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The crowd surged forward again, but this time Marcus stood firm, his circus performer's voice carrying authority across the square. "Enough," he commanded. "Can't you see? This takes something from him. We won't turn this into a carnival show." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew that their quiet life on the cottage's edge was over. Word would spread beyond Millbrook now, traveling the roads with merchants and pilgrims. They would come seeking miracles, and Marcus wasn't sure either he or Stellan was prepared for what lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Marcus led Tempest through the dew-laden grass. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival at the old Whitmore farm, and the donkey's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Her coat had regained its lustrous silver sheen, her eyes sparkled with renewed vitality, and her step carried a grace that defied explanation. Marcus had felt the change in himself as well. The ache in his joints that had plagued him for years had diminished, and his scarred hands moved with a fluidity he hadn't experienced since his fall. More importantly, the crushing weight of shame that had settled on his shoulders like a lead cloak was beginning to lift. "Today, old girl," he murmured, running his hand along Tempest's neck. "We begin again." He had fashioned a simple practice ring, using fallen branches and rope, marking out a circle in the flattest part of the meadow. It wasn't the grand circus ring he had once commanded, with its red and gold banners and roaring crowds, but it would serve their purpose. Tempest stood at the center, her ears pricked forward with an intelligence that still amazed Marcus. He had worked with countless animals during his circus days, but none had possessed this donkey's uncanny ability to anticipate his thoughts. "Remember, we start slowly," he said, raising his right hand in a gesture he hadn't used in 5 years. To his astonishment, Tempest immediately began a perfect sideways canter, her hooves barely disturbing the earth beneath them. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. He had planned to spend weeks teaching her basic commands, yet here she was performing movements that should have taken months to master. As they worked together, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around them seemed to shimmer with an almost imperceptible energy, and Marcus could swear he felt his body growing lighter with each passing moment. When he raised both arms above his head, a signal he had never taught her, Tempest rose onto her hind legs and began to walk in a perfect circle, her front hooves dancing through the air with impossible grace. "By the saints," Marcus whispered, lowering his arms as Tempest returned to all fours. "What are you?" The donkey fixed him with those luminous eyes, and for a moment Marcus could have sworn he saw starlight reflected in their depths, even though the sun blazed overhead. A sharp crack echoed across the meadow, followed by raucous laughter. Marcus spun around to see 3 figures approaching from the direction of town. He recognized them immediately. Garrett the blacksmith, accompanied by 2 of his drinking companions. All 3 men carried walking sticks and wore the smug expressions of those seeking entertainment at another's expense. "Well, well," Garrett called out, his voice thick with mockery. "Look what we have here, boys. The great Marcus Blackwood, training his precious ass in the middle of nowhere." The men spread out as they drew closer, clearly intent on surrounding the practice ring. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. He had endured months of such harassment in various towns, always choosing to flee rather than confront his tormentors. But something was different this time. Tempest had not retreated or shown any sign of fear. Instead, she had positioned herself between Marcus and the approaching men, her head held high and her stance firm. "Come to put on a show for us, have you?" Garrett continued, slapping his walking stick against his palm. "I've brought some friends who wanted to see the famous fool and his worthless donkey." "We're just practicing," Marcus said quietly, fighting to keep his voice steady. "We mean no harm to anyone." "No harm?" One of Garrett's companions, a weasel-faced man named Pike, let out a harsh laugh. "You're a walking joke, Blackwood. A has-been circus act making a fool of himself with that mangy creature. She's not mangy, Marcus found himself saying, surprised by the steel in his own voice. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Getting brave, are we? Maybe you need a reminder of your place. The blacksmith raised his walking stick, but before he could take another step, Tempest moved. She didn't charge or bray in alarm as any normal donkey might have done. Instead, she simply walked forward, placing herself directly in front of Garrett and looked up at him. The effect was immediate and profound. Garrett's stick fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, and his face went pale as parchment. His two companions stumbled backward, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Her eyes, Pike whispered, his voice barely audible. Look at her eyes. Marcus looked, and his own heart skipped a beat. Tempest's eyes were no longer brown or even silver. They had become pools of liquid starlight, ancient and infinite, holding depths that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the world itself. The three men turned and fled without another word, their walking sticks forgotten in the grass. Marcus stood transfixed, watching as Tempest's eyes slowly returned to their normal appearance. She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her expression that made his blood race with anticipation and wonder. Their real journey was just beginning. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Marcus led Petra down the winding path toward Millbrook. Word of their performance had spread faster than wildfire, carried by travelers and merchants who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the miracle they'd witnessed. What had begun as whispered rumors in taverns had grown into something else entirely. Pilgrims were coming. Marcus felt the weight of their expectations pressing against his chest like a stone. Behind him, Petra's hooves clicked against the cobblestones with unusual hesitancy, as if she too sensed the change that awaited them. The donkey who had once blazed with celestial fire now seemed smaller somehow, more fragile in the pale morning light. As they crested the hill overlooking the town square, Marcus stopped short. Below them, hundreds of people filled every available space. Makeshift camps dotted the surrounding fields, and a steady stream of newcomers continued to arrive along the main road. Banners and ribbons fluttered from windows, and someone had erected a crude wooden platform in the center of the square. Sweet mercy, Marcus whispered, his weathered hands tightening on Petra's lead rope. What have we done? A merchant from the outer villages spotted them first. His shout pierced the morning air like a bell, and suddenly the entire crowd was turning, pointing, surging toward them with desperate energy. Marcus instinctively stepped closer to Petra, who pressed against his side with a soft, worried whicker. Please! A woman in tattered clothes broke free from the crowd, dragging a pale, listless child behind her. Please, sir! My boy hasn't walked properly since the fever took him. They say your donkey can heal. The blessed beast, called another voice. Show us the miracle. Marcus raised his hands, trying to calm the advancing crowd, but they kept coming. Faces streaked with hope and desperation surrounded them. Mothers clutching sick babies, old men bent with arthritis, children with clouded eyes. The weight of their need was suffocating. I'm sorry, Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the din. You don't understand. What happened before, it wasn't, we can't just... But his words were lost in the chaos. Someone reached out to touch Petra's flank, then another, and suddenly dozens of hands were grasping at the donkey's coat, her mane, her ears. Petra reared back with a distressed bray, her eyes rolling white with panic. Stop! Marcus shouted, pushing people away from his companion. You're frightening her! But the crowd had tasted hope, and they wouldn't be denied. They pressed closer, their voices rising in a cacophony of prayers and pleas. A man with a withered arm grabbed for Petra's bridle. A woman fell to her knees before the donkey, weeping and babbling in a language Marcus didn't recognize. Petra's breathing grew rapid and shallow. The same soft glow that had emanated from her coat during their performance began to flicker weakly, sputtering like a candle in a storm. Marcus could see the fear in her dark eyes, the overwhelming confusion at the mob's desperate energy. "She's glowing!" someone screamed. "The miracle begins!" The crowd surged forward with renewed fervor, and that's when everything went wrong. Petra stumbled backward, her legs trembling with exhaustion and stress. The faint light that had begun to gather around her suddenly winked out completely, leaving only an ordinary, frightened donkey standing in a circle of increasingly agitated people. "Why isn't it working?" demanded the woman with the sick child. "Make her heal him." "The stories said she could restore sight to the blind," called another voice, tinged with growing anger. Marcus felt the crowd's mood shifting, hope curdling into suspicion and rage. He'd seen this before in the circus. Audiences who felt cheated, who believed they'd been the victims of some elaborate hoax. The energy was turning dangerous. "There's no trick," he said desperately, trying to shield Petra from grasping hands. "She's not a performing seal. You can't just demand miracles on command." "Fraud!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "It's all smoke and mirrors." "Charlatan! We traveled 3 days for this." Marcus made a split-second decision. Grabbing Petra's halter, he pushed through the crowd with surprising strength, his old circus instincts taking over. They broke free of the mob just as the first stone was thrown, missing Marcus's head by inches and clattering against the cobblestones. He ran, Petra galloping beside him with renewed energy born of pure panic. Behind them, the angry shouts of the crowd echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder. They didn't stop running until the sounds faded to distant murmurs, and the town of Millbrook disappeared behind a curtain of morning mist. Only then did Marcus allow himself to look at his companion. Petra stood with her head hanging low, sides heaving, looking for all the world like any other tired, ordinary donkey. The magic that had blazed so brilliantly just days before seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Matthias led Serafina toward the ancient stone circle that crowned the hill beyond the village. Word had spread like wildfire through the town about the miraculous healing at the baker's shop, and now curious faces peered from windows and doorways as the unlikely pair made their way up the winding path. Serafina's coat gleamed silver-white in the early light, no longer the dull, matted fur of the sickly creature he'd purchased mere days ago. Her steps were sure and graceful, and when she turned her great dark eyes toward him, Matthias saw depths of wisdom that made his breath catch. The transformation was undeniable, even to those who preferred skepticism to wonder. "You know what you are, don't you, girl?" he whispered, running his weathered hand along her neck. The response came not in words but in a warm pulse of understanding that flowed between them, as if they shared the same heartbeat. Behind them, a small crowd had begun to follow at a respectful distance. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Young Tom Fletcher carried his infant sister, the child whose fever had broken the moment Serafina had breathed upon her the evening before. Even gruff old Samuel the blacksmith had abandoned his forge to witness whatever was about to unfold. As they reached the stone circle, Matthias felt the familiar tingle of ancient magic in the air. These weathered monuments had stood here long before the village below was even a dream, their origins lost to time and legend. Local children dared each other to spend nights among the stones, and farmers spoke in hushed tones of strange lights and ethereal music that sometimes emanated from the hilltop during the deepest hours of darkness. Serafina stepped forward without hesitation, positioning herself at the center of the circle. The moment her hooves touched the worn grass within the ring of stones, the air shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The gathered crowd gasped as one, and several people stepped backward involuntarily. Matthias remained where he was, his heart hammering against his ribs. In his years with the circus, He had witnessed many unexplained phenomena, had learned to recognize the presence of forces beyond ordinary understanding. But this was different. This was sacred. A gentle wind began to stir. Though the morning had been perfectly still, it carried with it the scent of wildflowers that didn't grow in these parts, and something else, something clean and bright that reminded Matthias of his childhood dreams of flying. The stones themselves began to emit a soft, pearl-like glow, so subtle at first that he wondered if he was imagining it. Serafina raised her head toward the sky and released a sound unlike anything Matthias had ever heard. It wasn't quite a bray nor a whinny, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly creature and celestial being. The note hung in the air, pure and crystalline, and where it touched the ancient stones, the glow intensified. One by one, the stones began to resonate, each adding its own harmonic to the growing symphony. The sound washed over the assembled crowd like a gentle tide, and Matthias watched in amazement as years seemed to fall away from weathered faces. Mrs. Henderson straightened, her arthritis-bent spine suddenly supple. Tom Fletcher's sister gurgled with delight, her small hands reaching toward the dancing lights that now sparked between the stones. But it was the change in the people's eyes that struck Matthias most profoundly. The skepticism and hardened cynicism that rural life often bred had melted away, replaced by something he recognized from his own childhood: wonder, pure, unfiltered wonder at the impossible made manifest. The light reached its crescendo, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire hilltop was bathed in radiance that turned the ordinary world into something magnificent. Matthias felt tears streaming down his cheeks, though he couldn't say exactly why. It was as if every disappointment, every failure, every moment of shame from his past was being gently washed away by this tide of grace. Then, gradually, the light began to fade. The harmonic resonance of the stones quieted to a whisper, then to silence. Serafina lowered her head and stepped delicately out of the circle, but the change in her was unmistakable. What had been remarkable before was now clearly miraculous. She moved with a grace that belonged to no earthly creature, and when she approached Matthias, he could have sworn he saw starlight reflected in her dark eyes. The crowd remained silent for a long moment, absorbing what they had witnessed. Then young Tom Fletcher stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is she, Mr. Matthias? What have you brought to our village?" Matthias looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that now held respect where once there had been mockery, hope where once there had been disdain. He placed his hand on Serafina's neck, feeling the steady pulse of her extraordinary heart. "Salvation," he said simply, "for all of us." The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like whispered secrets as Marcus led Estrella through the town square. Word had spread overnight about the miraculous healing of young Timothy, and curious faces pressed against windows, watching their procession with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The donkey's coat gleamed silver in the pale dawn light, each step deliberate and graceful despite her recent illness. "They're all staring," Marcus murmured, his weathered hands gentle on the lead rope. "You've caused quite a stir, old girl." Estrella's ears flicked forward, and Marcus could swear he saw understanding in her ancient eyes. The transformation in her had been remarkable, not just physical, but something deeper. Where once she had been listless and withdrawn, now she carried herself with quiet dignity, as if remembering something long forgotten. They passed the baker's shop where Mrs. Holloway stood in her doorway, flour dusting her apron. She had been one of the loudest voices mocking Marcus's purchase just days ago, but now she watched in silence, her expression thoughtful. As they drew near, she stepped forward. "Mr. Castellano," she said softly, might I touch her?" Marcus paused, studying the woman's face. Gone was the cruel mirth that had twisted her features at the auction. In its place was something raw and vulnerable, Hope, perhaps, or desperate need. She's not a cure-all, Marcus warned gently. Whatever gift she possesses, it's not something to be demanded. Mrs. Holloway nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. It's my Arthur. He's been so sick, and the doctors say... She couldn't finish the sentence. Estrella had stopped walking. The donkey turned her great head toward the baker's wife, studying her with those impossibly deep eyes. Then, to Marcus's amazement, Estrella took a step closer and lowered her head until Mrs. Holloway could rest her palm against the velvet nose. The moment stretched like spun glass. Mrs. Holloway's tears fell freely now, and when she finally stepped back, something had shifted in her bearing, a lessening of the weight she carried, as if some burden had been shared rather than lifted entirely. "Thank you," she whispered, then hurried back into her shop. As they continued through the town, Marcus felt the weight of expectation growing heavier with each step. More people emerged from their homes and shops, forming a loose procession behind them. He recognized faces from the crowd that had jeered at the auction, the blacksmith with his perpetually scowling face, the merchant who had called him a fool, children who had thrown pebbles at his back as he'd led Estrella away. Now they followed in reverent silence, hope and hunger written across their features. Marcus led Estrella to the small meadow beyond the town limits where he had planned to let her graze, but as they reached the open space, he found they were not alone. A figure sat beneath the ancient oak tree that dominated the field, a woman in traveling clothes, her silver hair braided with ribbons that seemed to catch light that wasn't there. "You've found her," the woman said, rising gracefully to her feet. Her voice carried an accent Marcus couldn't place, musical and strange. "Or perhaps she found you." Marcus felt Estrella tense beside him, not with fear, but with recognition. The donkey's head rose high, ears pricked forward with an alertness that spoke of memories stirring. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, though something deep in his chest already suspected the answer would change everything. The woman smiled, and her eyes held the same impossible depth as Estrella's. "I am Lirali, keeper of the old ways. And you, Marcus Castellano, are not the broken man you believe yourself to be." The townspeople had caught up now, forming a wide circle around the meadow's edge. They watched with bated breath as Lirali approached Estrella, her hands moving in patterns that seemed to trace light in the air. "The blood of star-touched creatures runs thin in this world," Lirali continued, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "But it has not vanished entirely. Your Estrella carries the last spark of an ancient line, unicorns who chose to wear humble forms rather than fade from the world completely." Marcus felt his knees grow weak. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Lirali's eyes twinkled with ancient mirth. "More impossible than a dying donkey healing a child with her breath? More impossible than a disgraced performer recognizing something sacred in a creature others saw as worthless?" She placed her hand on Estrella's neck, and for just a moment Marcus could swear he saw a shimmer of something else. A graceful horn, spiraling toward the sky, a coat that gleamed like captured starlight, eyes that held the wisdom of ages. Then the vision faded, leaving only the familiar form of his stubborn, wonderful donkey. "The question now," Lirali said, turning to face the assembled crowd, "is what you will do with this gift that has been returned to your world." The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Marcus led Cornelius toward the fountain at its center. Word had spread quickly through the narrow streets. The strange man with his peculiar donkey was attempting something impossible. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls, children pressed against windows, and even the mayor emerged from his chambers to witness what many expected would be spectacular failure. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the whispered doubts that followed in his wake. 3 days had passed since their encounter with the bandits, and while some villagers now regarded him with grudging respect, Others remained convinced he was nothing more than a charlatan wielding parlor tricks. Cornelius walked beside him with unusual calm, his silver coat gleaming despite the early hour. The donkey's transformation continued to astound Marcus. Where once stood a sickly, stubborn creature, now moved an animal of quiet dignity and unmistakable power. Yet it was more than physical healing. Something ancient stirred behind those dark eyes, something that recognized the challenge ahead. At the fountain's edge, Marcus turned to face the growing crowd. Mayor Aldwin pushed through the throng, his face skeptical beneath his elaborate hat. "This is madness, Marcus," Aldwin declared loud enough for all to hear. "The fountain has been dry for 6 months. The finest engineers from the capital examined it and declared the aquifer permanently damaged. You cannot possibly—" "Sometimes," Marcus interrupted gently, "what appears broken simply needs someone who understands its true nature." He knelt beside the fountain's rim, running his fingers along the carved stone. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Dolphins and sea sprites danced around the basin's circumference, their forms worn smooth by decades of flowing water. But now only dust and dried leaves filled the hollow center. Cornelius stepped forward without prompting, positioning himself precisely at the fountain's north side. The donkey lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched the stone, and Marcus felt the familiar tingle that preceded their shared magic. "What's he doing?" someone whispered from the crowd. Marcus placed both palms flat against the fountain's base and closed his eyes. Through the stone, he sensed the deep channels that had once carried water from the underground springs. The passages weren't collapsed as the engineers claimed. They were sealed, clogged with decades of mineral deposits and debris that regular maintenance might have prevented. But there was something else. Something the engineers' instruments couldn't detect. The springs themselves pulsed with an energy that transcended mere hydrology. This fountain had been built on a convergence point, a place where the Earth's natural magic concentrated and flowed. Cornelius began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. Marcus opened himself to the sound, letting it guide his consciousness deeper into the fountain's hidden arteries. Together, they followed the block channels down through layers of limestone and clay, seeking the source. The crowd grew restless. Children fidgeted, while adults muttered about wasted time and foolish spectacles. Mayor Aldwin consulted his pocket watch with increasing frequency, clearly preparing to declare the demonstration a failure. Then Marcus found it. The heart spring, buried beneath tons of accumulated sediment. But the blockage was too dense, too firmly established for ordinary methods to clear. He would need to try something he'd never attempted before, something that required complete trust between himself and Cornelius. "Together," he whispered. The donkey's humming intensified, and Marcus felt their consciousness merge more completely than ever before. Through Cornelius, he touched something vast and ancient, the memory of water itself, the endless cycle that connected every drop in the sea to every raindrop, every stream to every cloud. They became the water, flowing backward through time to when the channels ran clear and bright. They became the pressure that had carved these passages, the mineral-rich springs that had fed the fountain for generations. And then, with a surge of will that left Marcus gasping, they became the force that swept away every obstruction. The first drops appeared at the fountain's center with barely a sound. A child pointed excitedly, but the adults dismissed it as imagination. Then came a gentle bubbling, followed by a steady stream that caught the morning sunlight like liquid crystal. Within moments, water cascaded from the fountain's 3 tiers in silver sheets, filling the basin with music that had been silent for half a year. The crowd erupted in amazed shouts and spontaneous applause. Marcus staggered backward, exhausted by the effort, but Cornelius remained steady at his side. The donkey's eyes held a satisfaction that seemed almost human, and Marcus realized they had accomplished something far greater than restoring water flow. They had proven that broken things could be healed, that what seemed permanently damaged might simply need the right touch, the proper understanding. As villagers rushed forward to cup the fresh water in their hands and splash their faces with joy, Marcus saw hope returning to eyes that had grown accustomed to disappointment. But he also noticed the stranger watching from the crowd's edge, a tall figure in a dark cloak whose presence sent an inexplicable chill down his spine. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a whispered secret as Marcus led Esperanza down the narrow mountain path. 3 days had passed since their encounter with the shadow creatures, and the donkey's transformation continued to unfold in ways that left him breathless with wonder. Her coat now shimmered with an almost imperceptible luminescence, and her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not just light, but understanding itself. "The oracle's pool lies just ahead," Marcus murmured, consulting the ancient map the hermit had given them. The parchment crackled between his fingers, its edges worn smooth by countless hands that had sought the same destination. "Are you ready for this, old girl?" Esperanza's ears twitched forward, and she quickened her pace despite the treacherous footing. Marcus marveled at how sure-footed she'd become, as if the very stones were guiding her steps. Gone was the stumbling, wheezing creature he'd purchased at auction. In her place walked something far more magnificent, a being whose true nature was finally emerging from years of deliberate concealment. The path wound through a grove of silver birches whose leaves whispered secrets in languages Marcus almost understood. As they emerged from the trees, the oracle's pool spread before them like a mirror made of liquid starlight. The water was so perfectly still that it seemed solid, reflecting not just the sky above, but glimpses of other skies, other times. "By the old gods," Marcus breathed, his circus performer's eye immediately recognizing magic when he saw it. "No wonder they guard this place so carefully." Ancient stone pillars ringed the pool, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Between the pillars, Marcus could see the shimmering barriers the hermit had warned them about, protections that would turn away anyone whose heart harbored selfish intent. Esperanza approached the nearest barrier without hesitation. The magical field crackled and sparked as she passed through it, but rather than repelling her, it seemed to welcome her presence. The symbols on the pillars began to glow with soft blue light. "I should have known," Marcus said, following close behind. The barrier felt like walking through warm honey, testing his intentions, weighing his soul. For a moment, images flashed through his mind, his pride, his fall from grace, his desperate purchase of a sick donkey. But beneath it all, the magic found something else. Genuine love for the creature beside him, and a desire to help her fulfill whatever destiny awaited. The barrier parted for him like curtains on a stage. They stood at the pool's edge, and Marcus felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon them. This was a place where the veil between worlds grew thin, where truth stripped away all pretense and illusion. "Show us," he whispered to the water. "Show us what we need to see." The pool's surface rippled once, and suddenly Marcus was looking down not at water, but at time itself. Images swirled in the depths, a golden city floating among the clouds, its spires reaching toward infinite skies. Winged beings moved through those spires with grace and purpose, and among them Marcus saw her. Esperanza, but not as she was now. In the vision, she stood tall and proud, her coat gleaming like polished silver, magnificent wings spread wide as she soared between the floating towers. She was beautiful beyond description, a creature of pure light and joy, whose laughter rang like crystal bells across the celestial city. "An angel," Marcus breathed. "You were an angel." The vision shifted, showing darkness creeping across the golden city. A great war raged in the heavens, and Marcus watched in horror as the beautiful beings fell like stars, their wings torn away, their light dimmed. He saw Esperanza falling, her celestial form fragmenting as she plummeted toward the mortal world below. The pool showed him her long exile, centuries spent in animal form, her true nature buried so deeply that even she had forgotten what she once was. He saw the auction where he'd found her, and understood with perfect clarity that their meeting had been no accident. The broken circus performer and the fallen angel, both seeking redemption. Another ripple, and the visions changed. Now Marcus saw what could be. Esperanza restored to her full glory, her wings spread wide as she took flight once more. But this time, she wasn't alone. The image showed Marcus beside her, somehow transformed himself, his own forgotten heritage awakening in response to her celestial fire. "We're connected," he realized, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Our destinies are intertwined." Esperanza pressed her warm muzzle against his shoulder, and for the first time since he'd known her, she spoke, not with words, but with a voice that resonated directly in his mind. Soon, her mental voice was like music. "When the convergence comes, when the barriers weaken, I will remember fully. And then, my faithful friend, we shall both reclaim what was lost." The pool's surface stilled, returning to ordinary water that reflected only their faces. But everything had changed. Marcus looked into Esperanza's eyes and saw eternity looking back. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Magnus led Esperanza down the winding path toward the crystal caves. Word had spread through 3 kingdoms about the miraculous healing that had taken place in Millbrook, and desperate souls were making pilgrimages from distant lands. But Magnus knew they needed to reach the caves before the crowds arrived, before those who would exploit Esperanza's gift could find them. The donkey moved with newfound grace, her coat now lustrous silver white, her eyes holding depths of ancient wisdom. The transformation that had begun weeks ago was nearly complete, and with it came both wonder and terrible responsibility. Magnus felt the weight of every step, knowing that their journey was drawing them toward something far greater than either of them had imagined. "Do you remember this place?" Magnus whispered as they approached the cave entrance, its mouth yawning like a portal between worlds. Esperanza's ears pricked forward, and she released a soft sound that seemed to harmonize with the wind itself. Inside the caves, crystalline formations caught and refracted the pale morning light, creating rainbows that danced across the stone walls. Magnus had been here once before, during his glory days with the circus, when a fortune-teller had spoken of destiny and sacrifice. He dismissed her words then, drunk on applause and his own perceived invincibility. Now those words echoed in the crystal chambers with prophetic clarity. As they ventured deeper, the air grew warmer, charged with an energy that made Magnus's skin tingle. Esperanza moved with purpose now, leading rather than following, her hooves striking the stone floor in a rhythm that seemed to awaken something dormant in the very earth beneath them. They emerged into a vast cavern, where an underground lake stretched into darkness, its surface perfectly still. At the water's edge stood a figure Magnus recognized, but had hoped never to see again. Madame Zilara, the circus's former mystic, her wild silver hair and piercing green eyes unchanged by the passing years. "I wondered when you would come," she said, her voice carrying the same haunting quality Magnus remembered. "Though I confess, I expected you sooner." "Zilara!" Magnus kept his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I should have known you'd be involved in this somehow." The old woman laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Involved? My dear Magnus, I've been waiting here for 7 years, tending the sacred waters, preparing for this moment. Did you think your meeting with Esperanza was mere chance?" Esperanza stepped forward, approaching the mystic without fear. Zilara reached out with gnarled fingers, touching the donkey's forehead with infinite gentleness. She remembers, Zalara murmured. Don't you, ancient one? You remember when you last walked in this form, when the world was younger and magic flowed as freely as mountain streams. Magnus felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding. What are you talking about? What is she? Not what, dear boy. Who? Zalara's eyes met his across Esperanza's back. She is Estrella, the last of the star-touched, who chose to bind herself to mortal form rather than abandon a world sliding into darkness. She has waited lifetimes for one worthy of sharing her burden. The truth hit Magnus like a physical blow. All the strange occurrences, the healing power, the way people were drawn to Esperanza. It wasn't simply magic, it was divinity walking among them, disguised as a humble donkey. But why me? Magnus's voice cracked. I'm nothing, a washed-up performer, a man who lost everything through his own arrogance. Because, Zalara said, dipping a crystal vial into the sacred lake, she needed someone who understood loss, who had fallen and could rise again. She needed someone who wouldn't seek to use her power for personal gain, but would help her heal a broken world. The water in the vial glowed with soft blue light as Zalara offered it to Magnus. Drink and accept the bond fully. Become her guardian in truth, her voice in a world that has forgotten how to listen to the divine. But know this, once you drink, there is no going back. Your life will no longer be your own. Magnus looked at Esperanza, seeing not just the gentle donkey he'd rescued, but the ancient being who had chosen to trust him with the most precious gift imaginable. In her dark eyes, he saw acceptance, patience, and something that might have been love. He thought of the children who had been healed, the hope returning to dying villages, the light slowly spreading across the land. He thought of his old life, the applause, the glory, the eventual fall, and realized it had all been preparation for this moment. Without hesitation, Magnus raised the vial to his lips and drank deeply. The water tasted of starlight and distant seas, of every dawn since the world began. Power flowed through him, not his own but shared, a connection that bound him to something far greater than himself. As the transformation took hold, Magnus understood at last why he had fallen so far, so that he could rise again, not for himself, but for everyone who still believed in miracles. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud as Marcus led Benedetto down the treacherous path toward the whispering caves. 3 days had passed since their encounter with the shadow drake, and the donkey's silver markings now pulsed with an inner light that seemed to grow stronger with each step toward their destination. The Oracle of Stones waits beyond the 3rd chamber, Marcus murmured, consulting the ancient map Elder Thorn had pressed into his hands before they departed the village. She'll know how to interpret the prophecy fully. Benedetto's ears twitched forward, and he released a soft bray that echoed strangely in the thin mountain air. Since drinking from the pool of starlight, the donkey had changed in ways Marcus was still discovering. His gait was steadier, his breathing unlabored despite the altitude, and there was an intelligence in his dark eyes that bordered on the supernatural. The cave entrance yawned before them like a hungry mouth, carved with symbols that predated any civilization Marcus knew. As they crossed the threshold, torches burst to life along the walls without any visible source of ignition, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Welcome, keeper of the ancient pact. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the stone itself. Marcus felt Benedetto tense beneath his gentle touch, but the donkey didn't retreat. If anything, he stepped forward with purpose, as if recognizing something familiar in this place of power. They passed through the 1st chamber, where crystalline formations sang with harmonious tones as their footsteps disturbed the air. In the 2nd chamber, pools of mercury-bright water reflected not their physical forms, but shadowy impressions of what they might become. Marcus saw himself crowned with starlight, while Benedetto's reflection showed a creature of pure radiance with wings of silver fire. The third chamber opened into a vast cathedral of stone, its ceiling lost in darkness above. At the center sat a figure that might have been carved from the mountain itself, the Oracle of Stones, her hair flowing like mineral veins through granite, her eyes twin pools of liquid amber. "So," she said, her voice the sound of settling earth. "The last guardian finally brings his charge home." Marcus felt his knees weaken. "Last guardian? I don't understand. I'm just a failed performer, a man who lost everything." The oracle's laugh was the sound of pebbles cascading down a cliff face. "Lost everything? Or shed the illusions that bound you to a smaller destiny?" She gestured to Benedetto, who had moved closer to her throne-like seat. "Do you know what you truly purchased at that auction, Marcus Holloway?" "A donkey," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "The last of the Luminari," the oracle corrected. "The guardian beasts who once protected the boundaries between the mortal realm and the places where wild magic runs free. When the old ways faded, when people stopped believing in wonder, the Luminari began to die out. This one," she reached out to stroke Benedetto's muzzle, "was the final egg, hidden away for centuries until the time was right." Benedetto's markings flared brighter, and suddenly Marcus could see him as he truly was. Not just a donkey, but something magnificent and ancient, a creature of legend wearing mundane flesh like a disguise. "But why me?" Marcus whispered. "Why was I chosen?" "Because you never stopped believing in magic, even when it abandoned you." The oracle's expression softened. "Your circus acts, your attempts to bring wonder to others, they weren't failures, Marcus, they were prayers. And prayers, when offered with a pure heart, are always answered." She rose from her throne, moving with the fluid grace of flowing water over stone. "The shadow drake was only the beginning. The barriers grow thin, and creatures of darkness seek to spill into your world. The Luminari must wake fully, must remember his true nature and purpose, and you, his chosen guardian, must help him remember." From within her robes, the oracle withdrew a circlet of woven silver and starstone. "This is the crown of binding, forged in the first days when the pact between Guardian and Luminari was sealed. When you place it upon your brow, the transformation will be complete for both of you." Marcus stared at the circlet, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail?" "Strength isn't the absence of fear," the oracle replied. "It's moving forward despite fear. You've already proven your worth by bringing him this far." Benedetto moved to Marcus's side, nudging him gently with his great head. In that touch, Marcus felt not just affection, but absolute trust. This creature, this magnificent, impossible being, believed in him completely. With trembling hands, Marcus reached for the crown of binding. The moment his fingers touched the starstone, light exploded through the chamber, and he understood that whatever came next, they would face it together. The oracle smiled as the light began to fade. "Now, Guardian, let us prepare you for what's to come." The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Marcus led Stella through the gathered crowd. Word had spread quickly about the previous night's miracle, how the sickly donkey had somehow healed young Thomas Whitmore's withered leg. Now half the town had assembled, some clutching sick children, others supporting elderly relatives, all of them looking at Stella with a mixture of hope and desperate hunger that made Marcus's stomach clench. "Please," called out Margaret Chen, cradling her infant son, whose breathing came in ragged gasps. "My baby hasn't been able to nurse properly since birth. The doctor says his lungs are weak." Marcus felt Stella tense beneath his gentle hand on her neck. Through their bond, he sensed her exhaustion. The healing she'd performed on Thomas had drained her more than she'd let on. Her coat, which had gained some of its old luster in recent weeks, seemed dull again in the harsh morning light. "I understand your desperation," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the square. "But healing isn't something that can be summoned on command. Last night was—" "A miracle," interrupted Father Morrison, stepping forward with his walking stick tapping against the cobblestones. "And miracles, my son, are meant to be shared." The crowd murmured agreement, pressing closer. Marcus saw hands reaching out to touch Stella, and he moved protectively in front of her. "She's not a magic charm to be rubbed for luck. She's—" A sharp whistle cut through his words. The crowd parted as Sheriff Coleman approached, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Behind him walked a man Marcus didn't recognize. Tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. "Marcus Hartwell," the sheriff called out. "This here's Mr. Ambrose Vanderhall from the Capitol. Says he's got some questions about your animal." Vanderhall stepped forward, removing a leather portfolio from his coat. "Mr. Hartwell, I represent certain interests who've heard remarkable stories about your donkey. Stories that, if true, would make her quite valuable to the right parties." "She's not for sale," Marcus said immediately. "Everything's for sale at the right price." Vanderhall's smile was cold as winter steel. "I'm prepared to offer you enough money to buy a dozen farms. Think of what you could do with such wealth. Think of the comfort you could provide for yourself in your golden years." The crowd had gone silent, watching this exchange with rapt attention. Marcus felt their eyes on him, weighing his response. These were the same people who had mocked him when he'd bought Stella at auction, who had called him a fool and a has-been. Now they looked at him with a mixture of envy and expectation. "The answer is no," Marcus said firmly. Vanderhall's expression hardened. "Perhaps you don't understand the gravity of your situation. Word of last night's events has already reached the capital. There are those who believe such power shouldn't rest in the hands of a common performer. There are concerns about regulation, about proper oversight. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a choice. Sell willingly or face the possibility of government seizure for the public good." The words hung in the air like a sword. Marcus felt Stella shift behind him, and through their bond came a flash of something that made his blood run cold. Memory fragments of another time, another place, when men in fine clothes had come with promises and threats. He saw flashes of a great circus tent, of Stella performing miracles before cheering crowds, of cages and chains and endless, grinding exploitation. "She's been through this before," Marcus whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Vanderhall's smile returned. "Ah, so you're beginning to understand. Your donkey is no ordinary animal, Mr. Hartwell. She's a creature of legend, one whose kind has been sought after for centuries. The celestial circus of ancient Rome had one. So did the court of the Sun King. They're drawn to those who need them most, but they never stay hidden for long." Margaret Chen stepped forward, her baby still whimpering in her arms. "Please, I don't care about any of this. I just need help for my son." Others in the crowd began voicing similar pleas, their desperation overriding any interest in the power struggle unfolding before them. Marcus looked at their faces, genuine suffering mixed with naive hope. These weren't greedy treasure hunters or power-hungry officials. They were simply people in pain, seeking relief. But as he met Vanderhall's calculating gaze, Marcus understood the trap being laid. Use Stella's power to help these people, and word would spread further. More officials would come, more pressure would be applied. Eventually, Stella would end up in a cage again, her gift exploited until it killed her. Refuse to help, and he'd be branded a selfish monster who hoarded miracles while children suffered. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Vanderhall said, tucking his portfolio away. "Choose wisely, Mr. Hartwell. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." The mountain path wound treacherously upward, each step taking Marcus and Serafina closer to the ancient temple that crowned the peak. The air grew thinner, and crystalline formations jutted from the rocky walls, humming with an otherworldly resonance that made Marcus's teeth ache. Seraphina's hooves found purchase on stone that would have sent any ordinary creature tumbling into the abyss below. "The Heartstone lies just ahead," she said, her voice carrying both anticipation and wariness. "But Valdris will not surrender it easily. He has had centuries to prepare his defenses." Marcus adjusted his grip on the staff Ilara had given him, a gnarled length of oak, embedded with stones that pulsed with gentle light. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, as if it had been waiting for his hands all along. Below them, the village looked like a collection of scattered pebbles, and he could barely make out the figures of people going about their daily lives, unaware that their fate hung in the balance. The temple materialized from the mist like a fever dream. Massive columns carved from black stone supported a structure that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its spires twisting impossibly into the sky. Runes covered every surface, glowing with malevolent red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. At the center of the courtyard stood a figure that made Marcus's blood run cold. Valdris had once been human, but centuries of dark magic had transformed him into something else entirely. His skin was translucent, revealing veins that ran with liquid shadow instead of blood. His eyes were pools of starlight that seemed to contain the depth of eternity. And when he smiled, his teeth gleamed like polished obsidian. "Welcome, little circus man," Valdris said, his voice echoing from the very stones around them. "And you, faithful Seraphina. How long has it been? 3 centuries? 4? Time loses meaning when one commands eternity." Seraphina stepped forward, her horn blazing with silver fire. "Your reign ends today, Valdris." The Heartstone was never meant for one being to possess. Valdris laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Possess? My dear creature, I am beyond possession. I am the Heartstone now. Its power flows through me and mine through it. To destroy me would be to destroy the very magic that keeps this realm alive." "That's a lie," Marcus said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Ilara told us the truth. You're a parasite, feeding on what was meant to nourish all." The sorcerer's attention turned to him, and Marcus felt the weight of that ancient gaze like a physical pressure. "Ah, the failed performer speaks. Tell me, Marcus Thorne, what do you know of failure? You who abandoned your dreams at the first setback? You who ran from responsibility when it became inconvenient?" Each word struck like a physical blow, dredging up memories Marcus had tried to bury. The night he had stumbled during his first major performance, the crowd's cruel laughter, the way his mentor had looked at him with disappointed eyes. The choice to walk away rather than fight for his place in the only world he had ever loved. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, and he felt Seraphina's surprise ripple through their bond. "I did fail. I did run. But I learned something in that failure that you, in all your centuries, never could." Valdris raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious. "I learned that falling isn't the end of the story," Marcus continued, taking a step forward. "It's just the part where you find out what you're really made of. And sometimes, the most broken things can be put back together stronger than they ever were before." He raised the staff, and its light intensified, cutting through the red glow of the temple runes. "You think power means never falling, never breaking. But real power, real magic, comes from getting back up," Valdris snarled, his composed facade cracking. "Enough philosophy, fool. Let me show you the kind of power that reshapes worlds." He raised his hands, and the very air around them began to tear. Reality twisted and buckled as shadows poured forth like living things, reaching toward Marcus and Seraphina with grasping tendrils. The ground beneath their feet cracked and split, revealing glimpses of an endless void below. Seraphina reared up, her horn cutting through the darkness like a blade of pure starlight. Where her light touched, The shadows hissed and retreated, but there were too many of them, pouring endlessly from the tears in space that Valdris continued to rip open. Marcus felt the staff growing warm in his hands, responding to something deep inside him, not just his determination, but his acceptance of who he had been and who he was becoming. The light spread up his arms, through his body, until he blazed like a beacon in the darkness. "Together," Seraphina said, and Marcus understood. They moved as one, woman and man united in purpose, their combined light pushing back against the tide of shadow that threatened to swallow the world. The dawn broke crimson over the ancient stones of Valdris Keep, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Marcus and Celestia made their final preparations. The weight of destiny pressed down upon them both. He could feel it in the tremor of her flanks, see it in the way her horn caught and fractured the early light into dancing rainbows. "The others should be in position by now," Marcus murmured, adjusting the leather satchel that held the heartstone of Aethros. The crystal pulsed with warm light against his chest, responding to Celestia's proximity. 3 days had passed since the village elders had revealed the truth of the coming darkness. 3 days to gather allies and forge a plan that seemed impossibly fragile against the magnitude of what they faced. Celestia's mental voice touched his mind like silk. "Hey, the Shadowmancer grows stronger with each passing hour. I can feel his influence spreading like poison through the ley lines. We cannot delay any longer." Marcus nodded, running his weathered hand along her neck. How different this touch was from those first desperate days when he'd fought to keep a dying donkey alive with scraps and stubbornness. Now he felt the power thrumming beneath her coat, the ancient magic that had been slowly awakening as her true nature reasserted itself. Yet she was still his Celestia, still the creature who had found him in his darkest hour and given him purpose again. A raven landed on the crumbling battlements above them, cawing twice before taking flight again. The signal. Captain Thorn and his men had secured the eastern approach. Somewhere in the forests beyond, Elena and the surviving members of the Circle of Stars were weaving protective wards around the keep's perimeter. And in the depths below, old Henrik worked frantically to activate the ancient binding circles that hadn't been used in 3 centuries. "Tell me again why this will work," Marcus said, though he'd heard the plan a dozen times. Sometimes a man needed to hear hope spoken aloud, even when fear gnawed at his bones. "Because the Shadowmancer expects power to meet power," Celestia replied, her horn beginning to glow as she gathered her strength. He expects armies and grand magic and heroes of legend. He does not expect a broken man and a donkey who learn to love despite their pain. The ground trembled beneath their feet. In the distance, the sky darkened as unnatural clouds gathered on the horizon. The Shadowmancer was coming, bringing with him the accumulated malice of 1,000 years of imprisonment. Marcus had seen what his influence could do: the withered crops, the maddened animals, the creeping despair that turned neighbor against neighbor. "I was afraid, you know," Marcus said quietly. "That night in the stable when you first showed me what you really were, I thought I was losing my mind." "And I was afraid you would run," she admitted. "So many humans had seen me only as a tool to be used or a prize to be won. But you saw me as myself first. That is why the magic chose you, Marcus. Not because you were the strongest or the bravest, but because you were kind when kindness served no purpose." The air grew thick and oppressive. Shadows began moving wrong, stretching toward them like grasping fingers. Marcus felt the familiar ache in his knee, where the circus accident had shattered his dreams years ago, but he forced himself to stand straighter. That broken man was still part of him, would always be part of him, but he was no longer defined by his failures. A sound like tearing silk filled the air as reality bent inward, and the Shadowmancer stepped through the veil between worlds. He was magnificent and terrible, a figure wreathed in living darkness with eyes like dying stars. When he spoke, his voice was the whisper of autumn leaves and the finality of closing graves. So, the last unicorn reveals herself at last, and brings with her... His gaze fell on Marcus with dismissive contempt, a crippled fool who plays with animals. Marcus felt Celestia tense beside him, her horn flaring with silver fire. But she waited, trusting him as he had learned to trust her. The heartstone grew warm against his chest, and Marcus stepped forward. "Maybe I am a fool," he said, his voice carrying farther than it should have, strengthened by magic and certainty. "But I know something you've forgotten in all your centuries of hate." The Shadowmancer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "And what wisdom does a failed performer think to teach me?" Marcus smiled, remembering Celestia's labored breathing in that first winter, her gradual healing, the moment when trust became love. That sometimes the most broken things, when they choose to heal together, become unbreakable. He placed his hand on Celestia's neck, and their combined light blazed forth to meet the darkness. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as Matthias stood at the edge of the great meadow, watching Stella graze peacefully among the wildflowers. 3 months had passed since their triumph at the Harvest Festival, and the transformation in both their lives seemed almost like a dream. The donkey's coat now gleamed with health, her eyes bright and alert, no longer the sickly creature he'd purchased for 3 copper coins. "Still can't believe it myself some mornings," came a familiar voice behind him. Matthias turned to find Mayor Aldrich approaching, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. The same man who had once shaken his head in disapproval now sought out Matthias's company regularly. "The way she moves," Aldrich continued, gesturing toward Stella, "like she's dancing with the wind itself. And those tricks of yours, I've seen court entertainers who couldn't hold a candle to what you two accomplished." Matthias felt the familiar warmth of pride, but it was different now, tempered with purpose rather than desperation. She was always capable of greatness. She just needed someone to believe in her. "Sounds familiar," Aldrich said with a knowing look. "The whole town's been talking about your plans. A traveling show, they say?" The letter in Matthias's pocket seemed to grow heavier. It had arrived yesterday from the Royal Entertainment Guild, an invitation to perform at the capital's spring celebration, with promises of audiences that included nobles and dignitaries from across the kingdom. After years of exile from the performance world, the doors were opening again. "The opportunity is significant," Matthias admitted. "More than I ever dared hope for after—" He gestured vaguely, the memories of his disgrace still tender despite the healing time had brought. Stella lifted her head, ears perked, and trotted toward them with that peculiar grace that never failed to amaze him. She nuzzled his shoulder gently, and he scratched behind her ears, a morning ritual they'd developed. "There's something else," Aldrich said, his tone growing serious. "Young Timothy's been asking about you every day. His parents think you might consider taking him along as an apprentice." Matthias had noticed the boy lingering around the meadow lately, eyes wide with wonder as he watched them practice. Timothy reminded him of himself at that age, hungry for magic, for the chance to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. "A traveling show needs more than just 2 performers," Matthias mused. "But the road can be harsh for a child." "Harsher than staying here with parents who don't understand his dreams," Aldrich countered. "That boy has stars in his eyes, Matthias. Don't let them dim the way yours almost did." As if summoned by their conversation, Timothy appeared at the meadow's edge, clutching a small bundle. He approached hesitantly, his young face a mixture of hope and fear. "Master Matthias," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I brought you something." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small wooden donkey, carved with painstaking detail. Every line spoke of hours of careful work, of devotion that went far beyond simple admiration. "I made it myself," Timothy continued, gaining confidence. I thought maybe Stella might like it. And if you're really leaving for the capital." Matthias accepted the carving, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was remarkable for one so young, but more than that, it captured something essential about Stella. Not just her appearance, but her spirit. "This is beautiful work, Timothy," he said softly. "Tell me, how would you feel about learning to make magic for real?" The boy's eyes went wide. "You mean, every great performer needs an apprentice. Someone to help with the equipment, learn the trade, maybe even develop their own talents along the way." Matthias glanced at Stella, who seemed to nod her approval. "But it won't be easy. Long days, constant practice, and the road ahead is uncertain." "I don't care about any of that," Timothy said quickly. "I just want to learn, to be part of something amazing." Matthias felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he'd had the first time he'd climbed onto a circus wagon as a boy, leaving his old life behind for the promise of wonder. "Then we leave at week's end," he decided. "Pack light, but bring your carving tools. A show needs props, and I suspect you'll have many ideas." As Timothy raced off to share the news with his parents, Matthias looked out across the meadow where his journey with Stella had begun. The townspeople had mocked his foolish purchase, seeing only a stubborn, sickly donkey and a washed-up performer. Neither of them could have imagined then what they would become together. Stella moved to stand beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new audiences, new chances to prove that magic lived in the most unlikely places. But today, in this moment, surrounded by wildflowers and morning light, their redemption felt complete. The road ahead sparkled with infinite possibility.